Starting next month, you'll be paying your own way in this house. I'm done watching my pension disappear into your little hobbies and your grandchildren's toys." My husband made the announcement standing in our kitchen in Kingston as though he were delivering a federal budget address. I simply nodded and continued stirring my tea. 2 weeks later, on Canada Day, he invited his entire extended family for a barbecue and fully expected me to feed 23 people. When they arrived and saw what I'd done instead, not one of them knew what to say. Howard's face turned almost the same shade as the beets growing in my garden. Before we continue, welcome back to the Quiet Revenge Stories channel. If you enjoy real-life family drama, quiet revenge stories, and powerful lessons about self-respect and boundaries, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, let's get back to what happened next. My name is Margaret, although nearly everyone has called me Maggie since I was a little girl running barefoot through wheat fields outside Regina. I'm 67 years old now, and for the past 34 years I've been married to a man named Howard. We live in a modest bungalow in Kingston, Ontario, on a quiet street lined with maple trees that set the neighborhood ablaze with color every autumn. 3 years ago, I retired from Kingston General Hospital after spending almost 4 decades working as a registered nurse. My pension isn't extravagant, but when combined with my CPP and OAS benefits, I receive a little over $4,300 a month after taxes. For a prairie girl who began working for 90 cents an hour at the co-op, I've always considered that a blessing. Howard retired 2 years before I did after a long career as a high school shop teacher, and between his teacher's pension and government benefits, he brings home roughly $3,900 a month. For most of our marriage, we pooled our resources without giving it much thought. I covered groceries, hydro, internet, phone bills, and many of the everyday expenses that keep a household running smoothly. Howard handled the property taxes, the mortgage before it was paid off, and the insurance on his truck. It wasn't a perfect system, but it felt fair enough, and it was very similar to how both of our parents had managed their marriages. Then retirement changed something in him. Howard started spending more time at the Legion with his brother Wallace, usually on Tuesday evenings. Wallace has never lacked opinions, especially when it comes to how women should behave in a marriage. Divorced twice and still convinced he's an expert on relationships, he seemed to have endless advice to offer. Then there was Howard's golf partner, Reginald, a man who had become convinced he was a financial strategist after watching a handful of investment videos online. Between the two of them, they managed to convince Howard that I had somehow become a burden on our household finances. At first, the comments were small enough to ignore. He'd ask whether I really needed a new winter coat when the old styles were on clearance at the Bay, or he'd question how much I spent on tomato seedlings every spring. I usually rolled my eyes and carried on because after 34 years of marriage, you learn that not every foolish remark deserves a response. But during the last Monday of June, he decided to turn those little comments into a policy. "Maggie, we need to have a chat about money," he announced, crossing his arms over his stomach while I unpacked groceries from Metro and placed a box of butter tarts for our granddaughter Emma into the refrigerator. Dewey, Wallace, and Reg have been explaining how they handle things. Everyone pays their own way. It's modern. It's fair. I folded one of the reusable grocery bags and set it aside. "Is that so? Starting July 1st, we split everything right down the middle. Groceries, internet, property taxes, all of it. If you want something special, you buy it yourself. I'll buy my own things. Wallace says it's the only sensible way to do it." I looked at him carefully. Wallace isn't married anymore. Howard. Well, that's beside the point. Standing there in his plaid shirt and slippers, he looked genuinely convinced he had stumbled onto some revolutionary economic theory. This was the same man who had never done a load of laundry in 34 years, still called me from the grocery store to ask where we kept the coffee, and only learned how to use the dishwasher because our granddaughter Emma showed him last Christmas. "All right, Howard," I said calmly. "If that's what you want, we'll try it." The surprise on his face was immediate. He blinked several times, clearly thrown off by the lack of resistance. Really, fair is fair. The tension drained out of him so quickly it was almost amusing. He had prepared for an argument. No doubt he'd spent time at the Legion rehearsing responses with Wallace over a pint of Keith's. Instead, he got agreement. "Well, all right then," he said with a satisfied grin. "I'm glad you're being reasonable. Wallace figured you might make a scene." I'm sure Wallace had lots of thoughts on the matter. Howard wandered into the living room to watch the Blue Jays, and I remained at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of red rose tea. As I sat there, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in a very long time. I started thinking carefully, not reacting, not arguing, just thinking. After 40 years as a nurse, I'd learned something important about people. The loudest patients were rarely the ones who worried me most. The truly dangerous situations often involved the quiet people, the ones who had stopped fighting and started paying attention instead. That evening, after Howard had gone to bed, I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and a shoebox full of receipts. And for the first time in years, I decided to see exactly what fair really looked like. That night, after Howard had gone upstairs and settled into bed, I remained at the kitchen table with my laptop, a calculator, and a shoebox full of receipts that I'd been saving for decades. Keeping receipts had always been one of my habits. Howard used to tease me about it and call it paper hoarding. But I grew up in a family where every dollar mattered, and old habits tend to stay with you long after you stop needing them. I opened a spreadsheet and began entering numbers. Groceries came first, every Wednesday afternoon. I did our shopping at the Loblaws on Princess Street. I bought food for both of us, along with whatever extras were needed for family visits, holiday dinners, or gatherings with the grandchildren. On average, I spent around $240 a week, which worked out to nearly $1,000 every month. The funny part was that I ate very little compared to Howard. I was perfectly content with toast, cheese, soup, or a simple salad, while Howard happily worked his way through bacon, steaks, ice cream, and enough snack food to stock a convenience store. From there, I moved on to utilities. Hydro averaged about $180 a month, and every payment came from my account. The internet and cable bill through Rogers was another $90. Our Bell mobile plans cost around $140. There was the Costco membership, Netflix, the Globe and Mail subscription that Howard read every morning with his coffee, home insurance, snow removal after he injured his back, the water heater rental, household supplies, cleaning products, and even the expensive shampoo he insisted on buying from Shoppers. The list seemed endless. The more receipts I entered, the quieter the house felt. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the spreadsheet was finished. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the total. Over the previous 3 years alone, I had personally spent more than $62,000 supporting our shared household. And that number didn't include the money I had given our son Nathan after his divorce, the contributions I made toward Emma's future education, or the financial help I sent to my sister in Medicine Hat after her husband passed away. Then I started a second list. This one wasn't about money. It was about labor. Howard's brother Wallace came for dinner every second Sunday without fail. For years, I cooked roast beef, potatoes, vegetables, homemade desserts, and enough food to send him home with leftovers. Howard's sister Doreen and her husband Frank visited several times every year, and every visit meant preparing the spare room, planning meals, organizing outings, and making sure everyone felt welcome. None of that work happened on its own. Then there were the months when Howard's mother lived with us before she passed away in 2020. I remembered helping her bathe, preparing her meals, managing her medications, and sitting beside her bed during difficult nights when she was frightened and couldn't sleep. Howard paid for the hospital bed rental and considered that his contribution, while I quietly carried everything else because someone had to. And then there was Canada Day. Every year for 16 years, Howard's entire extended family gathered in our backyard, 23 people the previous summer alone. Wallace, Doreen, Frank, cousins, spouses, grandchildren, and relatives from Peterborough who always arrived hungry and empty-handed. Every July 1st, I prepared brisket, salads, baked beans, pies, cakes, drinks, and enough food to feed an army. The costs added up quickly, about $600 each year, nearly $10,000 over 16 years. And in all that time, not one person had ever offered to bring so much as a bag of chips. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I finally closed the laptop. Upstairs, Howard was snoring loudly enough to rattle the silence. I lay awake for a while staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation from earlier that day. The more I thought about it, the clearer everything became. Howard believed fairness meant dividing bills. What he had never bothered to calculate was the value of everything else that had quietly rested on my shoulders for more than 3 decades. By the time I finally drifted off to sleep, I had reached a decision. If Howard truly wanted everything split down the middle, then I would give him exactly what he asked for. The following morning, I woke before sunrise and made myself a proper breakfast. I brewed good coffee in the French press, toasted a slice of seed bread, added homemade jam, and cut a piece of old cheddar to go with it. I sat at the kitchen table, enjoying the quiet while the first light filtered through the curtains. Howard wandered into the kitchen around 8 o'clock, wearing his housecoat and slippers. He looked around. Then he looked at me. "Where's breakfast?" he asked. I took another sip of coffee. "In the fridge, I suppose." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "Well, if we're each paying our own way now, I assumed you'd want to start planning your own groceries. July 1st is only a couple of weeks away." The confusion on his face was almost worth the price of admission. "I meant starting next month." "Oh," I replied pleasantly. I thought it might be easier to get used to it early. Preparation is always helpful. For a long moment, he simply stood there. Then he opened the refrigerator, stared at the contents, closed it again, and eventually settled for a bowl of cereal. I watched him eat in silence, and for the first time since his announcement, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not resentment, just curiosity. Because I was beginning to wonder how long Howard's grand experiment would last once he actually had to live inside it. The next few days were surprisingly productive. While Howard was still operating under the assumption that I'd eventually come to my senses and return everything to normal, I began quietly putting his new financial philosophy into practice. If everyone was paying their own way, then there was no reason for me to keep managing accounts that primarily benefited him. On Tuesday afternoon, I drove down to my Scotiabank branch and opened a new checking account in my name alone. I already had a TFSA Howard knew very little about, a fund I'd been contributing to gradually for years whenever there was a little extra money left over. It wasn't a secret so much as something he had never shown any interest in discussing. From that account, I transferred $3,000 into the new checking account and left the bank with a fresh debit card and a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. Freedom. Not dramatic freedom, not life-changing freedom, just the quiet comfort of knowing I had options. My next stop was Rogers. Both phone lines were under my account, along with the internet and cable package. After a pleasant conversation with a young representative who seemed far too cheerful for a Tuesday afternoon, I separated the phone plans, moved Howard's line onto his own billing arrangement, and downgraded the television package. I kept the basic internet because I actually used it, the sports channels, specialty packages, and endless extras that existed almost entirely for Howard's benefit disappeared. From there, I dealt with the remaining household services one by one. By the time I returned home, the practical side of Howard's proposal was already becoming reality. He was sitting in the living room eating ketchup chips and watching television when I walked through the front door. "Where'd you go?" he asked. "Just running errands." He nodded. Then he noticed the stack of paperwork in my hands. What kind of errands I set my purse down. I separated our phone plans. Your bill will come directly to you starting next month. I also canceled the cable package and kept only the basic internet service. The reaction was immediate. You canceled the cable. Well, I don't really watch it, but I do. I know. Maggie. The Jays are still playing. I smiled gently. And I'm sure there are many ways to watch baseball these days. Wallace probably has cable. For a few moments. He simply stared at me. I could almost see the gears turning. This wasn't how he imagined things would go. In Howard's version of events. Fairness meant I continued doing all the work while somehow paying less attention to how much it cost. The possibility that I might actually implement his rules had clearly never occurred to him. That Wednesday was grocery day. For decades, Wednesday afternoons had followed a familiar routine. I would shop for both of us, fill the cart with enough food for the week, and spend far more than I intended because there was always something someone needed. This time, I bought only what I personally wanted. Greek yogurt, fresh berries, a small piece of haddock, good cheese, quality coffee, seed bread, and a few simple treats. The entire bill came to $72. When I got home, I unpacked everything carefully and placed it on the left side of the refrigerator. Then I found a roll of blue painter's tape in the garage and ran a neat line down the center of every shelf. Howard walked into the kitchen just as I finished. What in God's name is that I stepped back to admire my work? My side and your side. His eyes moved from the tape to the nearly empty right half of the refrigerator. Then back to me. You're serious. Completely. For a moment, I thought he might argue. Instead, he closed the refrigerator door and walked away, muttering under his breath. By the end of the week, he'd made 4 separate grocery trips. Every time he returned, he seemed to have forgotten something important. One day it was milk, the next it was bread, then coffee, then condiments. His purchases consisted largely of frozen pizzas, bologna, chips, and whatever happened to be on sale. He spent more time driving back and forth to stores than he had spent helping with groceries during the previous 30 years. Thursday brought another small confrontation. I had a bowl of cherry tomatoes sitting on the windowsill, beautiful little red ones I'd purchased at the farmer's market. Howard reached for a handful. "Those are mine," I said. He stopped. "Maggie, they're tomatoes." "Yes, for heaven's sake. I bought them." The look he gave me suggested he was trying to determine whether I'd been replaced by an identical twin. He put the tomatoes back. An hour later, I heard him outside talking on the phone. I didn't need to guess who he was speaking to. Sure enough, Wallace called shortly afterward. The man had contacted me perhaps 4 times in 34 years, and suddenly he was concerned about household harmony. "Maggie," he began, "Howard says you've put tape down the middle of the fridge. I have? Well, that's a little extreme, isn't it?" I took a sip of tea before answering. Howard wanted a system where everyone pays their own way. I'm simply respecting his wishes. There was a long pause. That's not exactly what he meant. Then perhaps he should have explained himself more clearly. Wallace sighed heavily. "You know what I mean?" "No," I replied pleasantly. I know exactly what Howard said. The conversation ended shortly afterward. The following Friday, Howard entered the kitchen carrying several sheets of paper and wearing the cautious smile of a man approaching a wounded bear. "Maggie," he said carefully, "I've been doing some thinking." That sounds promising. Maybe I was a little quick with this whole arrangement. Maybe we should go back to the way things were. I looked up from the gardening catalog I was reading. "Oh, I don't think so." His smile vanished. "What do you mean?" "This has been educational. I'd like to continue for a while. But Canada Day is next week." I waited. "My family is coming." "Yes." "Maggie, what are we going to do about the food?" For the first time, I saw genuine concern in his eyes. I closed the catalog. What are you going to do about the food? Howard. The color drained from his face, and at that exact moment, I realized he had overlooked one very important detail. For 16 years, Canada Day had happened because I made it happen. Next year had never crossed his mind. Neither had this year. Until now. Howard stood in the kitchen holding his paperwork as though it might somehow rescue him. What are you going to do about the food, Howard? The question seemed to hit him harder than any argument could have. For 16 years, Canada Day had simply appeared around him like magic. The tables were set up, the food was prepared, the desserts arrived on time, and somehow 23 relatives left full and happy. He had never stopped to consider how much planning, shopping, cooking, and money went into making that happen. But you always do Canada Day, he said finally. Not this year. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. I returned my attention to the seed catalog in my lap. After several seconds, he wandered out of the kitchen looking completely lost. That evening, I heard him on the phone for nearly an hour. Sometimes his voice dropped low enough that I couldn't make out the words, while other times frustration crept into his tone. Later, when he thought I wasn't paying attention, I noticed him sitting at the computer searching for barbecue recipes that could feed a crowd. For the first time in our marriage, Howard was discovering that events do not organize themselves. The following week became strangely entertaining. He threw himself into preparations with the confidence of a man who had watched exactly 3 cooking videos and concluded he was now a caterer. He bought a giant freezer bag of discount hamburger patties from No Frills, 2 enormous tubs of store-brand potato salad and coleslaw, several packages of buns that were marked down because they were approaching their expiration date, and enough beer and Diet Cola to satisfy most of his relatives for an afternoon. What he didn't buy was almost more impressive. No decorations, no serving trays, no desserts, no paper napkins, no tablecloths, no paper plates. When I casually pointed this out on Friday evening, he waved a hand dismissively. They can use the regular plates. I looked up from my book. 23 people. Howard, so who's washing 23 plates? 23 forks, 23 knives, and 23 glasses. His expression suggested this detail had not previously occurred to him. I'll figure it out, I smiled. I'm sure you will. Meanwhile, I had my own plans. Unlike Howard, I believed in preparation. The Monday after his announcement, I called my daughter Claire in Ottawa. Claire was 39, worked for the federal government, and had spent at least a decade gently suggesting that I deserved more appreciation than I received. After I explained the entire situation, she laughed so hard she nearly lost her breath. "Mom," she said when she finally recovered, "I am so unbelievably proud of you. I was hoping you might say that. What do you need? Bring Raymond and the kids down for Canada Day." Done. There's one small twist. I explained the rest. By the time I finished, she was laughing all over again. My next call was to Margaret Conway, my next-door neighbor and closest friend for more than 2 decades. When I told her what I had in mind, she clapped her hands together like an excited child. "Maggie, this is magnificent. You don't think it's too much?" Not nearly enough? Her husband Donald was spending the holiday weekend at a cottage with his brother, leaving her backyard completely available. "Use every inch of it," she said. And so I did. I called my sister Eileen in Belleville and invited her up for the day. I ordered a catered picnic from a wonderful local business on Ontario Street. The menu included pulled pork sandwiches, fresh salads, a cheese and charcuterie spread, butter tarts, Nanaimo bars, and a beautiful Canada Day cake decorated in red and white. Then I booked a steel drum musician for 2 hours because Margaret had always loved live music and because, if I was being honest, the idea made me smile. Over the next several days, I quietly collected decorations. red and white bunting, small Canadian flags, a larger flag for Margaret's back fence. Everything was cheerful, festive, and completely separate from whatever disaster Howard was assembling next door. Canada Day arrived warm and sunny. I woke early, made myself a proper breakfast, and took my time getting ready. Instead of my usual gardening clothes, I slipped into a pale blue sundress I had purchased a month earlier. Howard had informed me at the time that it was probably too youthful for a woman my age. That memory alone made me enjoy wearing it even more. I curled my hair, put on my mother's earrings, applied a touch of lipstick, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who looked remarkably pleased with herself. Howard was already outside by 8 o'clock, struggling with folding tables and muttering at the barbecue when I stepped through the side door, carrying a covered tray. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Over to Margaret's." "Today?" "Yes, Maggie. My family will be here soon." "I know." He stared at me. "Aren't you even going to help?" I smiled sweetly. "I've left extra ice in the freezer. I thought that might be useful." For a moment, he looked as though he wanted to argue. Instead, he simply stood there watching me. I crossed the lawn into Margaret's backyard, and the second I stepped through the gate, she wrapped her arms around me. We laughed like two schoolgirls getting away with something. By mid-morning, guests began arriving. Claire and Raymond came first with the children. My sister Eileen followed shortly afterward with her partner Bernard. Several of Margaret's friends from Bridge Club arrived, along with her daughter from Gananoque. The caterers delivered enough food to fill 2 long tables. The steel drum player started setting up near the patio, and before noon there were 14 of us enjoying exactly the sort of Canada Day celebration I'd always wanted. Then, just after 12 o'clock, I heard the first car door slam next door. A few moments later came another, and another. Howard's guests had arrived. The show was about to begin. Just after noon, the first cars began pulling into our driveway next door. I could hear them arriving long before I saw anyone. Car doors slammed. Children shouted. Someone laughed loudly enough to carry across both backyards. Then came Wallace's unmistakable voice, booming through the summer air as though he owned half of Kingston. For a few minutes, everything sounded normal. Then the questions started. "Howard, where's Maggie? Is she inside? What's that smell?" The last question was followed by a brief silence. Then another voice. "Howard, are those burgers burning?" I took a slow sip of lemonade and settled more comfortably into my chair beneath Margaret's shade canopy. Across the yard, the steel drum player had just started his first set. The music drifted lazily through the warm afternoon air while my grandchildren chased one another across the grass. The catered food looked beautiful, spread across serving tables decorated with red and white bunting, and every few minutes someone would walk over to compliment the spread. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic if I'd hired a stage director. More vehicles arrived. Doreen and Frank showed up. Then their children. Then the cousins from Peterborough. Then spouses, grandchildren, and assorted relatives. Eventually, curiosity got the better of them. One by one, they wandered around to Howard's backyard, and then everything went quiet. Very quiet. The kind of silence that only happens when people are trying to process something they weren't expecting. I didn't need to look immediately. I already knew what they were seeing. Howard stood beside a smoking barbecue wearing a golf shirt with sweat stains spreading across the back. Several hamburger patties had clearly been sacrificed in the learning process. The folding tables looked uneven. Plastic tubs of supermarket potato salad and coleslaw sat directly on the tabletops. The discounted buns were stacked in their original bags. It wasn't a disaster, but it wasn't Canada Day at the Kinzellis either. For 16 years, those people had arrived expecting brisket, homemade desserts, decorated tables, cold drinks, and enough food to feed a small town. Instead, they found Howard. Then they looked over the fence, and there I was, a blue sundress, a glass of lemonade, live music, beautiful food, family and friends laughing together beneath bright Canada Day decorations. The comparison did all the work for me. A few moments later, Doreen appeared at the fence. "Maggie," she called. "What on earth is going on?" I stood and walked over. "Oh, hello. Doreen, why are you over there?" I smiled pleasantly. "Howard and I have a new arrangement. Everyone pays their own way now. Howard is hosting his family this year." For several seconds, Doreen simply stared at me. Then she turned slowly and looked back at her brother. The realization arrived in stages. First confusion, then disbelief, then understanding. Finally, pure irritation. "Howard," she said. The tone alone made me want another lemonade. What did you do? I didn't do anything." Doreen looked back at me, then back at him, then back at me again. "Maggie." I nodded. "Oh, it was very much his idea. I remember exactly where I was standing when he explained it to me, right beside the kitchen sink while I was putting away groceries." Howard shifted uncomfortably. "Now wait a minute." But Doreen wasn't listening anymore. Her hands landed firmly on her hips. "Howard Douglas Kinsella, please tell me you did not tell Maggie she had to start paying her own way." "Nobody said it like that. Did you, or didn't you?" Well, the hesitation answered the question. Doreen closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she looked ready to march across the yard and throttle her younger brother herself, not the woman who took care of Mom for a year and a half. Nobody spoke. Not the woman who's fed this entire family every Canada Day since 2008. Still nothing. Please tell me you're not that stupid. Howard opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. No words appeared. Across the yard, Wallace suddenly became fascinated by the barbecue. The man who had supplied so much advice over the previous month now looked as though he wished teleportation existed. "You absolute fool," Doreen said. The verdict landed with the force of a judge's gavel. Then she turned toward her husband. "Frank, we're leaving. What we're leaving." The grandchildren immediately started protesting. "But Grandma, nope. What about lunch?" "Not here." Howard took a desperate step forward. "Doreen, come on, stay. Have a burger." She stared at the blackened patties on the grill, then back at him. "I wouldn't eat one of those burgers if you paid me." Several relatives laughed despite themselves. That only made things worse. Within minutes, the entire gathering began dissolving. Families returned to their cars. Children climbed into back seats. The cousins from Peterborough left. Frank left. Doreen left. Even the relatives who clearly felt sorry for Howard eventually followed, one by one, car by car, until almost nobody remained. Wallace lingered the longest. I watched him speaking quietly to Howard near the barbecue. Eventually, a gust of wind carried part of the conversation across the fence. "Buddy, I told you not to take the split thing this far." Interesting. That wasn't what Howard had said earlier. Half the time I was joking. Even more interesting. A few minutes later, Wallace climbed into his truck and drove away too. And just like that, the great Canada Day gathering was over. 23 expected guests. 0 remained. The silence that followed felt almost surreal. Over in Margaret's yard, the steel drum player moved into another cheerful song. My grandchildren were helping themselves to dessert. Someone was cutting another slice of cake. Meanwhile, Howard stood alone beside a cooling barbecue and a table full of untouched food. Eventually, he walked toward the fence. The moment he appeared, Claire and Margaret Conway very politely found reasons to be somewhere else. I admired that. They wanted front row seats. But they also knew this part belonged to me. Maggie. Howard said quietly. Yes, please come home. I took another bite of butter tart before answering. Not just yet. Howard. He looked exhausted. Haven't I been punished enough? I considered the question honestly. Then I shook my head. No. Love. His shoulders sagged. You humiliated me. I set down my plate. For the first time all afternoon, my smile disappeared. No. Howard. You did that all by yourself. The words hung between us. I simply stopped helping you hide it. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he turned around and walked slowly back across the lawn. I watched him stand there alone among 23 uneaten hamburgers. And for the first time in 34 years, Howard was finally seeing what his life looked like without me carrying it for him. The week after Canada Day felt strangely quiet. For the first few days, Howard moved through the house like a man recovering from a minor natural disaster. He was polite, careful, and noticeably less certain of himself than usual. The confidence that had fueled his grand speech about fairness seemed to have evaporated somewhere between the last departing relative and the stack of uneaten hamburgers he ended up freezing. Small changes began appearing almost immediately. One morning, I came into the kitchen and found a fresh pot of coffee waiting. Thought you might like a cup, he said without looking up from the newspaper. Another day. I discovered the recycling had already been taken out. Later that week, I walked into the laundry room and nearly dropped my basket when I found Howard sorting whites from colors. The man who had spent 3 decades treating household chores like an exotic foreign language was suddenly trying to learn the basics. I noticed. I simply didn't comment. Then, on Saturday morning, he came into the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of tea. Maggie, he said carefully, I owe you a proper apology. I set down my book. All right, Howard, I'm listening. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with the words. I listened to Wallace and Reg when I should have listened to my wife. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself I was being taken advantage of. The truth is, I've been the one taking advantage. I remained quiet. Not because I disagreed, because I wanted him to finish. I didn't understand how much you did, he continued. Or maybe I understood and just got used to it. Either way, I was wrong. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. Inside, neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he looked up. Can we go back to the way things were? That question surprised me. Not because he asked it, because I already knew the answer. I looked at the man I'd been married to for 34 years, the father of my children, the man whose habits, flaws, strengths, and weaknesses I knew almost as well as my own. Then I realized something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. No, Howard. His face fell. What do you mean I don't want to go back to how things were? The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. Maggie. The truth is, the old arrangement wasn't working for me either. I just didn't realize it. He sat down slowly. I continued before he could interrupt. For 34 years, I made myself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. I handled things because it was easier. I carried responsibilities because nobody else volunteered. Then when you finally noticed all that work, you called me a drain on your pension. I didn't mean it. You did. The words came out gently, not angrily, just honestly. At the time, you absolutely meant it. I can forgive that, Howard, but I can't pretend it never happened. He stared down at the table. Suddenly, he looked older than I had ever seen him. Smaller, too. Are you leaving me? The question hung between us. I considered it carefully. I'm thinking about it. His eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since all this started, I think he truly understood how serious things had become. A few days later, I packed a small suitcase and went to stay with my sister Eileen in Belleville for 2 weeks. Every morning, I walked along the waterfront. I read novels. I ate in little restaurants and paid my own bill with my own card. I talked with Claire and Nathan, both of whom supported whatever decision I chose to make. I also spoke with a lawyer, not because I had made up my mind, because I wanted to understand my options. Knowledge has a way of making fear smaller. When the 2 weeks ended, I drove back to Kingston. Howard was waiting. The house was clean. The lawn was mowed. A plate of bakery cookies sat beside a pot of tea on the kitchen table. Even more surprising, the refrigerator contained groceries he had purchased himself. Proper groceries, not frozen pizzas, not bologna. Actual food. The blue painter's tape was gone. "Maggie," he said quietly, "if you stay, I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, cooking classes, less time with Wallace, more time listening, whatever you need." I sat down across from him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I picked up a cookie. "I'm not leaving." Howard. The relief on his face was immediate, but things are changing. His smile faded slightly, changing how I folded my hands on the table. "We keep separate finances." He nodded. "Fair enough. We both contribute to a shared household account every month." Another nod. "You do half the cooking." A longer pause. Then another nod. "You do half the cleaning." This one took him a few seconds, but eventually he nodded again. "Wallace comes for dinner once a month instead of every second Sunday." A very long pause, then a reluctant nod. "And if you ever again suggest that I'm a drain on anything..." I walk out that front door. The kitchen became very quiet. Finally, Howard looked up. "That's fair." I smiled. "I know it is. That conversation happened 2 years ago." Today, Howard does the laundry every Tuesday. He cooks regularly, although some of his early attempts at meatloaf remain unforgettable for reasons that have nothing to do with flavor. Wallace now hosts family gatherings at his own house from time to time after discovering that hospitality requires actual effort. Doreen calls me every month, and last Christmas she arrived carrying a homemade pie. A homemade pie. After 16 years of arriving empty-handed, I nearly cried. I still maintain my own bank account. I still buy myself little treats when I feel like it. Last September, I traveled to Prince Edward Island with Eileen while Howard stayed home and watered my tomatoes. When I returned, I discovered he had finally painted the kitchen the soft yellow I'd wanted for nearly a decade. Life isn't perfect. No marriage is. But life is good. More importantly, it belongs to me. Every bit of it. If there's one thing I'd want another woman to take from my story, it's this: love should never require you to disappear into someone else's life. You are not a burden simply because you've spent years giving. And if the person beside you forgets who you are and what you contribute, sometimes the most loving thing you can do for them and for yourself is remind them, clearly, firmly. And if circumstances happen to allow it, over a backyard fence on Canada Day, while steel drums play in the background. Looking back now, I don't think the most important part of that Canada Day was watching Howard stand alone beside a grill full of uneaten hamburgers. It wasn't hearing Doreen scold him, watching Wallace disappear, or even seeing 23 people realize who had really been carrying the weight of those family gatherings all along. The important part happened much earlier. It happened the moment I stopped arguing and started paying attention. For years, I believed being a good wife meant saying yes, filling in the gaps, and quietly handling whatever needed to be done. I thought love meant making life easier for the people around me. even when it made my own life harder. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that generosity and self-erasure are not the same thing. What surprised me most was that standing up for myself didn't destroy my marriage. It revealed it. Once all the invisible work was brought into the light, Howard finally had to see what had been there all along. More importantly, I had to see it too. I had spent decades measuring my worth by what I could do for everyone else. The moment I stopped doing everything, I discovered that my value had never depended on that in the first place. These days, when I sit in my yellow kitchen with a cup of tea and watch the evening sunlight come through the window, I feel something I didn't feel for a very long time. Balance. Not because life is perfectly fair. It never will be. But because I finally understand that fairness begins with respecting your own contribution instead of waiting for someone else to recognize it. If there's one lesson in my story, it's this: people often don't notice what you're carrying until you set it down. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do isn't making a scene, winning an argument, or walking away. Sometimes it's simply stepping aside and letting everyone see exactly how much you were holding up. That Canada Day changed Howard. But more importantly, it changed me. And after 34 years, that was long overdue.
This story is a work of fiction inspired by real-life situations that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. While the characters and events have been shaped for storytelling, the emotions, conflicts, and choices reflect truths that exist in everyday life. At Quiet Revenge Stories channel, every story is created to explore the complexity of human relationships, especially the difficult moments that test trust boundaries and self-worth. These stories are not just about drama, but about awareness, resilience, and the courage it takes to protect yourself when it matters most. The message behind our stories is simple, but powerful: love should never require you to lose yourself, and kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Life will sometimes place you in situations where you must choose between keeping peace and protecting your dignity, and in those moments, choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of something real, consider supporting the channel by subscribing to Quiet Revenge Stories channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, each one carrying a lesson, a reflection, or a truth worth hearing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.